Vyrana had spent her entire life in isolation, despite never being alone. Born into the Olyth species, she was one of the many children raised in the sterile, touchless chambers of their floating citadels. To the Olyth, physical contact was not merely uncomfortable, it was agony. Their hypersensitive skin, a result of their evolved nervous system, could detect the subtlest shifts in air pressure, temperature, and even electromagnetic fields. To be touched was to be burned, to be crushed, to be overwhelmed by unbearable sensation. She had learned early on to fear touch, to retreat from closeness, to embrace the cold precision of distance. And yet, she found herself now, against all odds, on Earth. The Olyth rarely sought diplomacy with lesser evolved races, but the growing interstellar alliances had forced their hand. Earth, a young and ambitious planet, was rising in influence. To ignore the humans was to risk being left behind in the galactic order. And so, Vyrana, a diplomat chosen for her mastery of linguistic precision and psychological control, was assigned to the Earth-Human Cultural Exchange Program. She was prepared for their loud voices, their chaotic emotions, their crude mannerisms. But she was not prepared for him, for the human doctor who would shatter everything she knew about her own body, for the touch that did not bring pain, but something else entirely. The air in the conference chamber was thick with the scent of synthetic fabrics and human perspiration. Vyrana stood at a deliberate distance from the human delegates, her violet-hued skin shimmering faintly under the artificial lighting. The long, flowing robes of her people concealed most of her form, leaving only her elongated fingers visible, fingers that had never, in her entire existence, brushed against another living thing. Across from her sat Dr. Jacob Renfield, a leading expert in xenobiology. His presence had been insisted upon by the Terran delegation. Earth scientists were eager to study the Olyth up close. He had dark hair, a rough jawline, and piercing green eyes that made her feel strangely watched. The humans were overly expressive, their thoughts etched into their faces. Jacob, however, had a stillness about him. The meeting proceeded as expected, discussions of trade agreements, resource exchanges, and cultural misunderstandings. Vyrana spoke in flawless standard Terran, her voice cool and measured. The humans listened, fascinated by her otherworldly tone. And then, the accident happened. A sudden tremor shook the building, the result of a minor atmospheric disturbance. Chairs scraped against the floor, and a stack of data tablets slid from the table's edge. Jacob, moving on pure reflex, reached out to steady her as she stumbled. His hand brushed against her wrist. Vyrana braced for the searing, nerve-shredding pain that she had known since infancy. But it never came. Instead, she felt warmth. A steady, grounding warmth that spread through her skin like liquid sunlight. A sensation she had no name for. She gasped, her entire body locking into place. The room fell silent. Jacob withdrew his hand immediately, his expression shifting to something between horror and fascination. "Are you hurt?" he asked, voice careful, as though afraid to cause harm. Vyrana looked down at her wrist, at the place where his skin had met hers. No burns, no ruptured nerves, no internal screaming. Just heat. And something else, something terrifyingly unknown. She turned and walked out of the room without another word. The encounter haunted her. She had spent decades avoiding even the lightest brush against another being, knowing that even an accidental touch could send her into convulsions of agony. And yet, Jacob's hand had touched hers, and she had not suffered. Why? The question consumed her thoughts, enough that she requested an audience with the human scientist under the guise of further diplomatic discourse. Jacob arrived at her quarters in the Olyth embassy, his presence careful, his movements precise. He knew by now how dangerous physical proximity was to her kind, and yet his curiosity remained evident. "I assume you called me here because of what happened," he said. Vyrana studied him for a moment before answering. "I require an explanation." His lips quirked, a brief, unintended smile. "So do I." Together, they began the experiments. Jacob ran scans, took samples of her bioelectric field, mapped the hypersensitivity of her neural pathways. She allowed herself to sit closer to him than she had ever sat to another being. watching the way his hands moved as he worked. Then came the real test. She extended her hand. "Do it again," she ordered. Jacob hesitated. "Are you sure?" Vyrana nodded. Slowly, cautiously, he reached forward. His fingers brushed against hers, light, feather-soft. Again, no pain. Vyrana exhaled sharply, her body taut with an emotion she couldn't define. Jacob looked just as stunned. "This isn't normal, is it?" "No," she whispered. His fingers pressed slightly more, just enough for her to register the pressure. Still nothing but warmth. The Olyth did not believe in fate. But at that moment, Vyrana could not help but wonder. Why him? Why could she bear his touch and no other? Their research continued in secrecy. If the Olyth High Council learned of her anomaly, she would be recalled immediately, examined, possibly even quarantined. And so, she and Jacob met in the quiet hours, conducting test after test. The more she allowed herself to be touched, the more she became aware of other things. The way his scent carried the faint trace of earth and salt. The way his eyes studied her not with the detached curiosity of a scientist, but with something deeper. And then, the results arrived. Jacob stood over his tablet, brows furrowed in disbelief. "It's your nervous system," he said, "or rather, how it interacts with mine. The Olyth experience pain from touch because of an overactive nerve response, but somehow, my bioelectric signature neutralizes that response. My presence acts as a counterbalance." Vyrana sat still, absorbing the implications. "You are an anomaly," she murmured. Jacob let out a breathy laugh. "Likewise." For the first time, a thought entered her mind, one she had never dared entertain. What if I didn't have to live in isolation? Vyrana had always prided herself on discipline. She had spent her life mastering the art of control, of speech, of thought, of movement. The Olyth revered precision, and she had always been a model diplomat, never allowing emotions to govern her decisions. And yet, control was slipping through her fingers like sand. The tests with Jacob continued under the guise of scientific research, but she could not ignore the way she anticipated them, not for the results, but for the act itself, for the touch. It had started simply. His fingertips brushing her wrist, the brief contact of his palm against hers. But as the experiments progressed, so did the complexity of their interactions. Jacob began testing different areas of her skin, her forearm, her shoulder, even the back of her neck, where Olyth neural clusters were most concentrated. Each time, the result was the same. No pain, only warmth, and something else, something that lingered long after the contact ended. She found herself watching his hands when he wasn't looking, studying the rough texture of his skin, the way his fingers flexed when he was deep in thought. This was dangerous. It was more than scientific inquiry now. It was need. And the more she indulged it, the harder it became to stop. One evening, in the quiet dimness of her quarters, they ran another test. Jacob sat across from her, sleeves rolled up, his forearms resting on the sleek, glass-like surface of the Olyth research table. He had insisted on a new variable, prolonged contact. "We know brief touches don't trigger pain," he said. "But what about sustained pressure?" Vyrana hesitated. She had allowed herself to be touched in brief moments, but the idea of holding contact was unsettling. Still, she extended her hand. Jacob did the same, palm up. Slowly, carefully, she lowered her fingers into his. His hand was much warmer than hers, his skin rougher, covered in the microscopic ridges that humans called fingerprints. The Olyth had no such imperfections. Their skin was smooth, seamless, unblemished. She expected the familiar sensation of warmth. She did not expect the slow, creeping ache that settled in her chest. Something in her shivered. Jacob's fingers curled slightly, his thumb brushing the side of her hand. His expression was unreadable, but his heartbeat. She could hear it, steady and low, like a drum in the silence. This was wrong. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't. Vyrana pulled back. Jacob let her go without protest, but his eyes studied her too carefully. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. She exhaled, flexing her fingers as if trying to rid them of the ghost of his touch. "I do not know." The Olyth did not believe in intuition, but Vyrana had learned to trust the subtle shifts in atmosphere that preceded danger. When the High Council summoned her for a private transmission, she knew before even answering that they suspected something. The holographic chamber in the embassy flickered to life, revealing the translucent forms of 3 Olyth elders, silent, expressionless. Their eyes, as always, betrayed nothing. Ambassador Vyrana, one of them intoned, "Your interactions with the human scientist have been noted." Vyrana did not flinch. Dr. Renfield is assisting in scientific research concerning Olyth physiology. It is within the bounds of my diplomatic duties. You have allowed physical contact, another elder said. This is not within the bounds. A slow dread unfurled in her chest. The Olyth did not punish their own, not openly. But those deemed compromised were quietly removed from their positions, reassigned, sometimes even erased from records. I have not suffered injury, she stated, careful to keep her tone neutral. That is precisely the concern. Silence stretched between them. Finally, the first elder spoke again. Your mission on Earth is nearing completion. You will return to Olyth Prime in 7 rotations. 7 rotations. Barely a standard week. They were pulling her back. She inclined her head. Understood. But as the transmission ended, something inside her twisted. She had thought she wanted to leave. To return to the safety of her people, the familiarity of distance. Then why did the thought of leaving him feel like suffocation? Vyrana did not tell Jacob about the recall order. She did not know why she kept it from him, perhaps because speaking it aloud would make it real. Instead, she continued their research as if nothing had changed. But Jacob knew. She saw it in the way he watched her, in the way his hands hesitated before touching hers. He could sense something was wrong, but he did not press her, not until their final night. Vyrana stood in the dim light of the embassy observatory, staring out at the vast skyline of the human city. The stars above were distant, cold. Something's wrong, Jacob said behind her. She closed her eyes. I am returning to Olyth Prime. Silence. Then, when? Tomorrow. She turned to face him, expecting anger. Instead, she saw something worse. Acceptance. You weren't going to tell me, he murmured. I saw no reason to. Jacob let out a quiet breath. I guess I should have expected this. You're a diplomat. You follow orders. Something sharp lodged in her chest. She did not understand this pain. It was not physical, yet it hurt more. You do not understand, she said. This is my duty. Jacob studied her for a long moment, and then, for the first time, he closed the distance. Vyrana did not stop him. His hands cupped either side of her face, warm, steady, grounding. A human gesture of comfort. A human gesture of something else. She did not move away. She did not want to. This isn't just science anymore, is it? He asked quietly. She could not answer. Because if she did, she would have to admit the truth. That she had found something impossible in him. That she did not want to leave. And that, for the first time in her life, she feared distance more than touch. Vyrana was not accustomed to indecision. Her life had been a series of precise, calculated movements, every action weighed, every word measured. Yet now, as she stood before Jacob with his hands still warm against her skin, she found herself caught in something unquantifiable. For the Olyth, emotions were secondary to logic. To desire something beyond duty was irrational. And yet, she could not ignore the way her body leaned toward him, the way his presence had become an anchor against the vast emptiness she had always accepted as her nature. You don't have to go, Jacob said softly. His voice was steady, but she heard the undercurrent beneath it. A plea. Her throat tightened. You know that is not true. There has to be a way. There is not, she interrupted. My people have made their decision. The moment they suspected an anomaly, they deemed me compromised. If I do not return willingly, they will retrieve me. Jacob's jaw tightened. And what happens when you go back? She hesitated. The Olyth did not execute their own, but exile could be just as final. If the High Council determined that her condition, the inexplicable ability to endure human touch, was a deviation from Olyth purity, they could sever her from society entirely. Isolation. Permanent. Irreversible. A cage, without bars. She exhaled, steadying herself. It does not matter. I was never meant to stay here. Vyrana. He said her name the way no one else ever had, like it meant something more than just duty and title. His hands were still on her face. She had not moved to remove them. Her body did not want to. Then, for the first time in her life, she made a decision that had nothing to do with diplomacy, nothing to do with reason or duty. She reached up, trembling, and placed her own hands over his. The contact sent a ripple through her, an unfamiliar, weightless sensation. Not pain, not even warmth. Something deeper. "Jacob," she said, barely above a whisper. His gaze dropped to her lips. She felt the shift in the air between them. And then, a sharp chime cut through the moment. Vyrana flinched, stepping back as the embassy's warning system activated. The blue glow of an incoming transmission flickered into existence. The High Council. Her time had run out. Vyrana did not answer the summons immediately. She turned to Jacob instead, pressing a hand to his chest, not to push him away, but to ground herself. "You must go," she said. "I'm not leaving you alone in this," Jacob said, shaking his head. "You have no choice," she said, but the words rang hollow. For the first time in her life, she did not want to be alone. Still, she forced herself to step away, forced herself to turn toward the glowing interface where the High Council's summons waited. With a steady breath, she accepted the transmission. 3 elders appeared, their translucent forms hovering in the room like specters of fate. "You did not report as ordered," one said, voice devoid of inflection. "My departure was scheduled for tomorrow," she said evenly. "I did not believe an immediate response was necessary." "The situation has changed," another elder said. "Your continued presence among the humans has compromised the integrity of your mission. You are to be extracted immediately." The word extracted sent a chill through her. This was not a recall. This was something more severe. Jacob stiffened beside her. Extracted? The elders ignored him. To them, he was irrelevant. Vyrana's mind raced. If they forcibly extracted her, what would happen to Jacob? Would they erase his memories? Would they consider him a contaminant, a threat to be neutralized? The thought sent a jolt of fear through her. "I am not in distress," she said carefully. "I will return as scheduled." "Your compliance is no longer required," the first elder responded. The transmission ended. A cold silence filled the room. Then, the low hum of an approaching Olyth vessel vibrated through the walls. They were already here. Jacob was already moving. "We have to go." Vyrana blinked. "That is not possible." "Like hell it isn't," he snapped, grabbing her wrist. His touch sent a familiar warmth through her, but now it was accompanied by urgency, desperation. "Listen to me," he said. "If they take you, do you really think they'll let you come back? Do you think they'll let you keep the knowledge of what we've discovered?" She knew the answer. The Olyth did not tolerate anomalies. Jacob's grip tightened slightly. "We run. Now." Vyrana hesitated only a moment longer. Then, for the first time in her life, she ignored the voice of duty. She chose herself. She chose him. Vyrana had never run before. Olythans did not flee. They retreated strategically, withdrew when necessary, but they never ran. Never abandoned their place in the carefully maintained order of the galaxy. But as she followed Jacob through the dim corridors of the Terran embassy, the pounding of their footsteps echoing through the halls, she realized she was doing exactly that. Running. Running from her people. From her past. From the life she had always believed was inescapable. And for the first time, she did not care. Jacob led her with practiced efficiency, navigating the embassy's back channels with ease. The human was trained for this. His past in xenobiological fieldwork had taken him to war-torn planets, unstable colonies, and regions of space where diplomacy had no meaning. She had thought of him as merely a scientist. She had been wrong. As they reached a service exit, a deep, reverberating hum shuddered through the walls, the sound of an Olyth extraction vessel descending. "They're here," Jacob muttered. He pulled up his wrist device, tapping rapidly. "I have a contact in the lower districts. He owes me a favor. He can get us off-world." Vyrana hesitated. "Jacob, if you do this, you will be hunted." His eyes met hers, unwavering. "So will you." A beat of silence passed between them. Then she nodded. "Lead the way." They stepped out into the night. The city was alive with neon light and the distant hum of hovercrafts cutting through the rain-drenched air. The Olyth extraction vessel had landed 2 blocks away, its sleek silver hull gleaming under the streetlights. Vyrana could feel them. Olyth enforcers, silent, relentless. They would not be seen, not by human eyes, but they were already moving. They had come for her. Jacob pulled her into an alleyway, pressing her back against the cold metal of a building. He glanced around the corner, scanning the streets. "Do they use tracking implants?" he asked. Vyrana shook her head. "No. Our physiology rejects foreign materials. But they will be using biosignature scanners. They can detect my neural field if we stay in open space for too long." Jacob exhaled sharply. "Great. That means we need to stay in motion." Before she could respond, a shadow shifted above them. Vyrana barely had time to react before a figure dropped from the rooftop, landing with silent precision. An Olyth enforcer. The figure was clad in a seamless bodysuit, its surface shifting with the ambient light, rendering them nearly invisible. Their face was concealed behind a featureless mask, expressionless, merciless. "Vyrana," the enforcer intoned, voice metallic through their helmet. "Come with us. Do not resist." Jacob moved before she could. He lunged, drawing a compact energy weapon from his belt. A human design, crude compared to Olyth technology but efficient. He fired. The enforcer dodged with inhuman speed, the shot barely grazing their armor. In a blur of motion, they closed the distance, striking Jacob with a precise, nerve-targeting blow. He grunted, staggering back, but he did not fall. Vyrana reacted on instinct. She was no warrior, but she had studied Olyth combat techniques as part of her training. The enforcer expected compliance, not resistance. She used that against them. She spun low, striking at their knee, a weak point even among their kind. The enforcer faltered for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Jacob recovered, slamming the butt of his weapon into their temple. The enforcer collapsed, momentarily stunned. "Move," Jacob hissed, grabbing her hand. She did not resist. They ran. Jacob's contact was waiting in a dimly lit underground dock. Rogue pilot with a weathered face and cybernetic eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. "You're late," the man grunted. "And you've brought company." His gaze flicked to Vyrana. "She's the client," Jacob said shortly. "Can you get us off-world or not?" The pilot exhaled, glancing at his ship, a rusted, heavily modified freighter barely holding itself together. "Depends. How much trouble are we in?" A distant thrum vibrated through the air. The Olyth vessel was scanning the district. Jacob didn't even look back. "A lot." The pilot sighed. "Figures. Get in." They boarded just as the first warning sirens began to wail. Vyrana took one last look at the planet she had once believed would be nothing more than a temporary diplomatic post. She was leaving it behind. She was leaving everything behind. And for the first time in her life, she had no idea what awaited her next. The freighter lurched violently as it shot into the atmosphere, its engines sputtering under the strain of an unplanned escape. The ship was old, barely holding together, but it was fast enough to get them out before the Olyth enforcers could lock onto them. Vyrana braced herself against the bulkhead as artificial gravity flickered, her body unaccustomed to the rough, chaotic nature of human ships. The Olyth did not travel like this. Every one of their vessels was built for seamless precision, silent and smooth. But humans? Humans seemed to embrace imperfection, even in flight. She felt Jacob's presence beside her, solid and steady despite the turbulence. "You holding up?" he asked. She exhaled, steadying herself. "For now." The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "I hope you two know what the hell you're doing. Because once we break orbit, there's no going back." Vyrana glanced at Jacob. He was watching her, waiting. She thought of the High Council's cold decree, thought of the enforcers who had tried to drag her back, thought of the life she had always believed was hers, sterile, touchless, empty. And then she thought of the warmth of Jacob's hand. "There is nothing to go back to," she said. Jacob nodded. Then we moved forward. The freighter's engines roared, and the planet fell away beneath them. Deep space. The moment they crossed into open void, the tension in Vyrana's chest should have lessened. But it did not. She sat in the small, dimly lit cabin Jacob had secured for them, her fingers absently tracing the ridges of the metallic surface before her. Her mind was still trying to catch up with what had happened. She had spent her entire life believing that to disobey the Olyth High Council was unthinkable, that her people's laws were absolute. And yet, she had broken them. Second thoughts? Jacob's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He was leaning against the doorway, arms crossed. Vyrana hesitated. "No," she said, though the weight in her chest told a more complicated truth. Jacob stepped inside, lowering himself onto the seat across from her. The dim lighting cast shadows along his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his features. He was watching her carefully, but not with judgment. Just patience. "You can tell me if you do," he said. "I'd understand." Vyrana studied him. He had given up much for her already. His career, his standing on Earth, perhaps even his safety. "You should not have followed me," she said. Jacob smirked. "You say that like you gave me much choice." She shook her head. "You do not understand. I am not merely a defector. I am an anomaly to them. The Olyth do not tolerate anomalies. If they pursue me, they will pursue you as well." Jacob leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Then I guess we're both fugitives now." Vyrana exhaled slowly. "You are too willing to throw away your life for something uncertain." Jacob's gaze didn't waver. "You're not uncertain to me." The words unsettled something deep inside her, something she had never allowed herself to name. Before she could respond, the intercom crackled. "Got a problem?" The pilot's voice rang through the cabin. "An Olyth vessel just dropped out of hyperspace. They're scanning for us." Vyrana's blood went cold. "They found us," she whispered. Jacob was already moving. "We need to act fast." The freighter's bridge was small, filled with the hum of outdated controls and flickering screens. The pilot was hunched over the console, his cybernetic eyes whirring as he scanned the readouts. "One ship," he muttered. "A scout vessel. But that means the main fleet isn't far behind." Vyrana stared at the display. The Olyth ship was sleek and elegant, its presence a stark contrast to the crude, patchwork design of their own. It was faster, more advanced, and equipped with technology that could disable their vessel in seconds. If they were caught, there would be no negotiation. Vyrana turned to Jacob. "We cannot outrun them." "Then what do you suggest?" he asked. She hesitated. There was only one option, a reckless, desperate option, one that went against every instinct she had ever known. "We let them board us." The pilot scoffed. "Oh, great plan. Let the enemy waltz right in and kill us." Vyrana ignored him. She was focused on Jacob. "They want me," she said. "Not you. If I can stall them, you and the pilot can disable their ship. It is our only chance." Jacob clenched his jaw. "You're asking me to just hand you over?" "No. I am asking you to trust me." A heavy silence settled between them. Finally, Jacob exhaled. "This is a terrible plan." She allowed herself the faintest smile. "Yes, but it is the only one we have." The Olyth ship loomed closer. There was no more time. The airlock hissed as the Olyth boarding party arrived. Vyrana stood motionless, her posture composed, betraying none of the turmoil beneath. The lead enforcer stepped forward, helmet gleaming under the ship's dim lighting. "You are to be returned to Olyth Prime for evaluation," they said. "Comply, and we will ensure minimal force is used." Vyrana tilted her chin slightly. "And if I refuse?" The enforcer did not answer. But the subtle shift of their stance told her everything she needed to know. There would be no refusal. She cast one last glance over her shoulder. Jacob was hidden, waiting. The moment the enforcers lowered their guard, he would make his move. This had to work, because if it didn't, there would be no escape. Vyrana took a slow breath, forcing herself to remain calm. Then, she stepped forward, right into the heart of the enemy. Vyrana moved with deliberate slowness, every step a calculated effort to appear compliant. The Olyth enforcers did not lower their weapons, but they did not restrain her yet. That was a mistake. The moment they underestimated her would be the moment she struck. Behind her, Jacob remained hidden in the shadows, waiting for his opportunity. The plan was simple. She would create a distraction, something big enough to pull the enforcer's attention away for a fraction of a second. That was all Jacob and the pilot needed to disable the Olyth ship. But if she miscalculated, if the enforcers anticipated her resistance, then she would be leaving this ship as their prisoner. Or not leaving at all. The lead enforcer, taller than the others, stepped forward. Their helmet's voice modulator distorted their tone, but the command was unmistakable. Do not resist. Vyrana kept her expression neutral. I have no reason to resist. I only wish to speak with the council directly. You will speak when spoken to. They raised a small, circular device, an Olyth restraint collar. The moment it was activated, it would lock around her throat, suppressing neural activity and rendering her body limp. It was a tool meant for containment, a method to control anomalies like her. This was her moment. The second the enforcer reached forward, Vyrana moved. Her hypersensitive nervous system registered the shift in air pressure before they could react. She twisted sharply, stepping into the enforcer's guard instead of away from it. With precise, fluid motion, she redirected their grip, forcing them off balance. A human would have stumbled. An Olyth enforcer recalibrated instantly, but it was enough. Jacob emerged from the shadows, striking before the second enforcer could raise their weapon. The crack of a human fist against an Olyth helmet was a dull, jarring sound, but it did the job. The enforcer staggered. The pilot fired a shock round from across the corridor. It hit center mass, sending the soldier crashing against the bulkhead. Chaos erupted. Vyrana ducked as another enforcer lunged for her, their movements too fast, too precise. But she was already shifting. She wasn't stronger. She wasn't faster. But she had something they didn't. She could endure touch. Vyrana caught the enforcer's wrist before they could strike. Their reaction was instant, an Olyth's natural aversion to skin contact. Even through gloves, the sheer nerve sensitivity made direct physical grappling an impossibility for them. For her, it was different. She tightened her grip and wrenched the enforcer's arm into a lock. They faltered, just long enough for Jacob to fire. The stun round hit them square in the chest. Silence followed. Vyrana exhaled, pulse pounding in her ears. 3 enforcers, neutralized. Jacob let out a breath. Remind me never to fight you. She turned to him, but before she could respond, the pilot cursed. We've got a problem, he said. The Olyth ship just sent a distress call. Vyrana's stomach clenched. Reinforcements were coming. We need to move. Now. Jacob grabbed one of the fallen enforcer's weapons, a sleek, plasma-based design with Olyth markings. He tested the weight of it in his hands. Can you fly that thing? He asked the pilot, nodding toward the Olyth vessel docked outside. The pilot scowled. That's military-grade tech. Even if I could get past the biometric locks, I wouldn't last 5 minutes in an Olyth combat ship. Vyrana's mind raced. We do not need to fight, she said. We need to disappear. Jacob raised an eyebrow. You have a plan for that? The Olyth rely on predictive algorithms to track fugitives, she explained quickly. They calculate possible trajectories based on known behaviors, escape patterns, and previous alliances. The pilot caught on. So if we follow a predictable route, we're dead. Yes. Jacob exhaled sharply. So where do we go that they won't expect? Vyrana hesitated only for a fraction of a second. Then she spoke the name of a place she had never intended to visit. Aether's Veil. The pilot stiffened. Even Jacob, who rarely showed fear, frowned. You're serious? Jacob asked. She nodded. Aether's Veil was a dead zone, a lawless expanse of space beyond the edges of any sanctioned territory. It was a place where rogue scientists, outcasts, and the remnants of failed civilizations vanished. The Olyth did not go there, because even they feared what was hidden in its depths. Jacob let out a slow breath. You really know how to pick our vacation spots, don't you? The pilot grimaced. If we go there, we might not make it back. Vyrana met his gaze. If we do not, we will not survive anyway. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, the pilot sighed. Fine, but if we die, I'm haunting you both. Jacob smirked. Deal. With that, the ship veered hard, changing course. And as the stars shifted, Vyrana felt something stir in her chest. For the first time in her life, she was not running from something. She was running toward something unknown. The freighter plunged toward Ether's Veil, its engines straining as the ship crossed the invisible boundary into the dead zone. The moment they entered, Vyrana felt it, the unnatural silence, the void beyond the void. Ether's Veil was more than just uncharted space. It was a graveyard of failed civilizations, abandoned research stations, and derelict ships drifting like ghosts. The place where those who were unwanted by the galaxy disappeared. And now, they were among them. The pilot, gripping the controls tightly, muttered under his breath. Navigation's glitching. No star maps, no gravitational readings. We're blind out here. That's why the Olyth won't follow, Vyrana murmured. Jacob, seated beside her, checked the sensors. Let's just hope we don't fly straight into something we can't get out of. Outside the viewport, space shifted in unnatural ways. Stars that should have been fixed in place seemed to drift, stretching and warping like reflections in disturbed water. Vyrana had read about this phenomenon. The region was known to distort space-time. No one knew why. The Olyth had once sent an expedition here. None had returned. We need to find a place to land, Jacob said. Figure out our next move. The pilot scoffed. Next move? We just ran straight into the place people come to die. What move? Before Vyrana could respond, the ship lurched violently. Alarms blared. Something had latched onto them. Jacob gripped the edge of his seat. What the hell was that? Vyrana's blood ran cold as she looked at the scanner. A signal, she whispered. Someone, something, is pulling us in. The freighter groaned as unseen forces dragged it toward a massive structure hidden in the mist of the veil. As they neared, Vyrana saw it. An ancient, abandoned space station, its exterior battered by time and radiation. Its design was unfamiliar, unlike any known species. Dark metal stretched in intricate, almost organic patterns, as if the station had grown rather than been built. This wasn't on any charts, Jacob muttered. Of course it wasn't, the pilot said grimly. Places like this? They don't exist until they find you. The ship shuddered as docking clamps engaged, sealing them into the station's hold. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. Then, a voice crackled over the ship's failing comms. Welcome, lost ones. Vyrana froze. The voice was Olyth, but it did not belong to the High Council. It was something else. The airlock hissed open, revealing the dark corridors beyond. Vyrana stepped forward cautiously, Jacob and the pilot close behind. The station was cold, the air stale, thick with the scent of metal and something older. Something wrong. Then she saw them. Figures standing in the darkness. Olyth. Or at least they had once been. Their skin, once smooth and unblemished, was cracked with deep fissures, their eyes glowing faintly with unnatural light. Their movements were slow, measured, as if they were listening to something only they could hear. Jacob tensed. Vyrana. She stepped forward. Who are you? One of them, a woman with hollowed features and two thin limbs, tilted her head. We were once like you, she said, but we have seen beyond the veil. And soon, so will you. Vyrana felt a chill crawl down her spine. Jacob's grip tightened on his stolen Olyth weapon. Yeah, I think we're done here. You cannot leave, the woman interrupted. The moment you entered, you became part of this place. And now, you must listen. The walls hummed. A sound, low and reverberating, filled the air. Not heard, but felt. It crawled beneath the skin, into the bones, into the mind. Vyrana staggered, gasping. She felt something reach into her thoughts, pulling, whispering, unraveling everything she had believed to be true. A presence, older than the Olyth, older than the stars. Something that had been waiting. She tried to pull away, to resist. But the more she fought, the more she understood. This place was not abandoned. It had been left behind. And now, it had found her. Vyrana fell to her knees, visions flashing through her mind. Images of civilizations before hers, before humans, before any known species. Beings who had touched something they should not have touched. And now, she had touched it too. Jacob's voice broke through the haze. "Vyrana, stay with me," she gasped, reality snapping back into focus. The Olyth figures watched her in silence. "You have seen," the woman whispered. "Now you must decide." Vyrana swallowed. Her pulse was erratic. She did not understand what she had seen, not fully. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that the High Council had sent expeditions here before. And they had lied about what they found. Her people knew. They had always known. "Come with us," the woman said, "or return to a life that no longer belongs to you." Jacob pulled her close, his hand warm against her arm. "We don't have to stay here," he murmured. "We can go. Forget this place. Find somewhere safe." Safe. The word meant nothing now. There was no safety. Not from the truth. She looked up at him. "If we leave, they will keep hunting us. Then we keep running." She exhaled. "And if there is nowhere left to run?" Jacob hesitated, but his grip did not loosen. She turned back to the waiting figures. Her choice had already been made. "I want to know," she said. The Olyth woman smiled. Jacob's breath hitched. "Vyrana." She turned to him one last time, reaching out, touching his face with a certainty she had never known before. "You gave me something I never thought I could have," she whispered. His fingers curled around hers, desperate. "Then don't leave." She smiled softly. "I am not leaving. I am becoming." And then, before he could stop her, she stepped forward. Into the darkness. Into the unknown. Into Ether's veil. Jacob stood at the threshold for a long time, staring at the place where Vyrana had disappeared. The pilot shifted uneasily. "We should go." Jacob didn't move. He knew. She wasn't coming back. Not as the woman he had known. Finally, he turned away, stepping back onto the ship. As the airlock sealed behind him, he cast one last look at the station. And for just a moment, in the swirling shadows beyond, he thought he saw her watching. But her eyes were no longer hers. And then, as the ship pulled away, Ether's veil swallowed her whole.